Hey everyone, Nightharo here, and today I've got a 1-bar Brittle-den build for you. As always, everything's timestamped below, so if you want to go ahead and skip ahead to a particular topic, feel free to go ahead and do so. I am going to do a bit of an intro here, talk about a few different things about DPS, using 1-bar builds in different settings and stuff like that. So if you're not interested, again, go ahead and skip ahead. You're probably already gone by now. All right, for those of you who are sticking around. So this build parses up to 99k. I personally was able to get to 90k with this build. And on the 2-bar build that I've had for this Warden, I was able to get to 110k. So we're talking about a 20k difference there, going from a 2-bar build to a 1-bar build, or about a 20 to 25% DPS loss. So just so you're aware of what you're giving up by going with a 1-bar build. Now, I want these builds, these 1-bar builds, to be something you can use in veteran trials, because I think that's, a pretty reasonable, top level that what most people should be able to do. When you get into hard modes, I think honestly anybody can do them, but it requires some time, a decent amount of effort. You really need to know the trial, so you need to ran it on regular vet quite a few times, and I don't think that's something that everybody's going to be interested in, but I think everybody can run vet trials, and I think they're a blast. So I want to, that's the main thing I try to do, is help people get into vet trials, and so I want this to be a build. All my 1-bar builds, I want them to be something you can grow on. So this is actually a simplified version of my 2-bar Brittle-den build, which parses 120k. And so the idea here is that you could start with something a little bit simpler, a little bit easier, and then you could grow and then do something else. The other requirement here is I'm making this for solo content, but I'm also making it for group content. And in group content, everybody really needs to be helping out the group in Elder Scrolls Online. If you've ever parsed on the trial dummy as opposed to the training skeletons, the trial dummy, the big iron atro, there's a couple of different forms of it, but the one with the 21 million health, those give you all the buffs that you would, not everything you can possibly get, but a lot of the buffs you would conceivably get in a group trial. And typically that makes your DPS twice what it would be on the skeleton. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about, this gives you 5% extra damage. This gives you 10% extra critical damage. Well, the whole point of the trial dummy is it gives you all those things that all the classes and all the buff sets would give you. Again, not all of them, but many of them would give you. And it ends up doubling your damage. So those 5%, they add up over time. So I don't want to give you a 1-bar build or any build for group content that doesn't provide group buffs. And that's what it's really all about. Anyways, I just wanted to make that clear. I know that a lot of people make builds, especially kind of newer person-friendly builds like this is, and they say, this is for all content in the game, and it's just not true. And if you go into a vet trial with a build that doesn't parse very high and isn't a very good build, people will kick you from the group. And while it, maybe they shouldn't do that, or maybe they could talk to you and help you or whatever, it's also not completely unreasonable if you're doing very little DPS. And anyways, I just think it's can be unfortunate, and I want you guys to be well informed. So just know what you parse. Definitely do a parse before you go into a vet trial that is more than the Craglorns, or maybe even possibly Veteran Maw Floorcosh or something. You do want to do a little bit of practice and stuff like that. All right. Well, that out of the way, preamble out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about this build. The first skill up here is probably our second most important skill, and that is going to be our shocks. Now, this has different names, Deep Fish or whatever, but the actual creature that it shoots out are their shocks, and that's actually in the description. And so we're going to start off with, in any group content, we want to use the stamina version of this spell. And if you're solo, you want to use the Magicka version. And the reason you want to use the stamina version in group content is because it does a little bit more damage. And the benefit, the Magicka version, it gives you major and minor breach. But if you're in group content, your tank is going to be providing that major and minor breach for you, so you don't need it. So, however, in overland or solo content, you absolutely want that. It's going to increase your damage by a ton, a whole lot. So it's something, if you're switching back and forth, honestly, it's kind of worth going and remorphing it if you're doing a lot. However, if you're doing one or the other, you could put it to magic or stamina and leave it. Just realize if you're doing anything with a DPS check, or if you want to get a little bit more DPS out of it, that you want to make sure that you're remorphing it for the appropriate content. Oh yes, and by the way, the unmorphed version of this skill is called Scorch. The stamina version is called Subterranean Assault, and then the Magicka version is called Deep Fisher, just so you know where it is. And that's in the Animal Companion skill line. Next up is going to be Winter's Revenge, and this is a morph of Impaling Shards. So this is one of the ways we're getting our frost damage is from this ability. It's gotten a lot of buffs in the recent patches. It's AoE, does a lot of damage, and is otherwise just a great spell and ability to have. It will help apply that chilled status effect, and that gets us a little bit extra damage. And then we're actually going to skip the next skill just because it's from the Destruction Staff skill line, and let's go ahead and talk about Arctic Blast, which is our 4th skill on the bar. Arctic Blast is a morph of Arctic Wind, and this is an AoE, so where Winter's Revenge, we could throw it out and drop an AoE wherever. Arctic Blast is actually centered on us, and it's in a 5-meter radius around us, which is actually a decent sized area, especially in any kind of solo content where mobs are chasing you, but you do want to be in melee to be able to hit a target with this ability, so just keep that in mind. The other part of this skill, it lasts for 20 seconds, and we're using it for the DPS. However, this is actually our burst heal, so that's really cool. So we have a burst heal that also is a damage over time ability. So if you ever need a heal, this is it. You can use it on your bar, hit this button, and it should heal you pretty close to max health, if not to full health. All right, now moving back here, the skill that we skipped over is called, the unmorphed version is Destructive Touch, and then what we want to morph is Destructive Reach. I will note that it's very important that you do Destructive Reach because the other morph, Destructive Clench, taunts, and it does less damage and it taunts. So we do not want Destructive Clench, we want Destructive Reach. Make sure that that's the one you choose. I will note that whenever you equip this and you have a particular destruction staff on your bar, I will note whenever you equip this and you have a destruction staff equipped, it will change the name. So with an ice staff, instead of Destructive Reach, it'll be called Frost Reach, because of the ice staff. So just keep that in mind. Don't let that confuse you. It's still the same ability. It just changes based on what kind of staff you have equipped. This is going to be our main spammable, and something that with the optimal version of this build, with the charged Master's Ice Staff, we want to be casting this skill every 4 seconds. And the reason for that is with the Master's Ice Staff, it gives us a whole bunch of weapon and spell damage whenever we use this ability, but it only lasts for 4 seconds. So every 4th cast, we want it to be of this Destructive Reach. If you have your skill timers on, basically what I do is every time I see a 17 on the skill, so it's counted down to 17, I know that the next skill that I want to cast is this, and that means it'll be at 16 seconds, which is, out of a 20-second duration, and so we recast it. Again, it does have a damage over time ability, which you can use if you have multiple targets, but in general, we're just going to use this as our spammable, and we're not going to worry or let the damage over time part of this skill tick off. We're just going to keep recasting it. If you're using a crafted set or something like that, it's not that important that you cast it every 4 skills. Just keep all your dots up and then use this whenever you can. But with the Master's Ice Staff, it will increase your damage greatly if you cast it every 4 skills. I will also note that whenever we cast Destructive Reach with a Frost Staff, it is going to guarantee to be applying the status effect, and for a Frost Staff, that is going to be the chilled status effect, and that is also going to proc Minor Brittle. What Minor Brittle does is it increases the critical damage done to that opponent by you and everybody else in your group, which, as we talked about earlier, is one of those primary things. This build, that's one of the things it's bringing to the table is that Minor Brittle. In super sweaty and optimized groups, you might have a tank or a healer or someone else doing Minor Brittle, but in most groups, you will not have anybody. So you being able to do this actually increases the DPS for the group by a considerable amount. And it's always great to feel like you're contributing to the group and helping everybody else succeed, in addition to just providing your own DPS. It's very important in trials and group content that everybody tries to provide some buffs, because while it might not be that big of a deal just for yourself, in aggregate with everybody doing that, it actually ends up being quite a bit of damage. And honestly, that is really the difference between the trial dummy and the skeleton. Okay, the trial dummy has all those buffs that you might expect in an optimized group. I know that some people seem to think that the dummy is like rigged or it's cheating or something. The whole point of the dummy is to give you all those buffs you would expect to have in a fairly optimized group. And honestly, it doesn't even give all of them that you can get in an optimized group. So sometimes in group content, your damage can be more than it would be on the trial dummy. But that's the whole purpose of the trial dummy is to give you all those buffs so you can get kind of an idea of, hey, how does this build that I have, how does it do in a trial? Because some classes provide more buffs than others. So if you're only relying on your own buffs, you might get a different number than what you get in an actual trial. So it's trying to give you a real world number. That's the whole point of it. All right. And moving on to our last skill on this bar, we are going to be using, this is from the Fighter's Guild skill line. And it's called Barb Trap. The unmorphed version is called Trap Beast. And we can use both versions of this. I would just note, if you need a ranged version, you can use Lightweight Beast Trap. It does a little bit less damage, and so that's why we're choosing Barb Trap. But if you need to be ranged for any purpose, and this whole build can be ranged, by the way, our shocks only go so far, but you can be fairly far back with your shocks, and in most situations you could basically be at range and still hit someone with your shocks, no problem, if you're standing in a formation in a trial or something. So then you would use Lightweight Beast Trap, but again, we're just going to use Barb Trap for this build because I'm assuming you can at least sneak into melee for a couple of seconds. Now, Barb Trap is a little weird of a skill. It does take 2 seconds to arm, or a second and a half actually. So you do want to recast it whenever it says 2 seconds left on the duration, so that you won't have any downtime. And we're casting this ability because it does pretty good damage, and it also provides us with Minor Force, which increases our critical damage by 10%. Similarly to how our Minor Brittle increases critical damage for the entire group by 10%, Minor Force increases it, in this case just for us, by 10%. And that is huge. And increasing your critical damage is a really big deal. You're usually going to have at least 50%, maybe up to 60 or 70 in group content of your damage being critical hits. And so increasing that damage by 10% ends up being about a 5 to 7% DPS increase. So pretty big deal. If you're thinking about, 100k parse, that's another 5 to 7k damage. The other thing about this skill is that there's passives in the skill line. The Slayer passive from the Fighters Guild skill line increases our weapon and spell damage by 3% for each Fighters Guild ability slotted. So this is also going to increase, just by having it on our bar, all of our other abilities, the damage done by them. And then for the flex spot here, we're going to be using either a Fetcher Infection or Growing Swarm. This is a morph of the Swarm skill. Swarm is the unmorphed version. Both the Mag and Stamina version are both fine to use. The Magicka version does a little bit more damage single target. Every second cast that makes it do half again as much damage, which is significant. And that you can cast on multiple targets, which is pretty cool if you're doing something like Portals and Cloud Rest or something, because you can dot up each target and then just go ahead and move to the next one. And then the other morph, the Stamina morph Growing Swarm, that version, it does damage in an AoE. So this can be useful for solo content. If you're trying to do more AoE damage, you could potentially use Growing Swarm. Or if you were struggling with Mag and you wanted something that cost stamina and you didn't want to use the Magicka version, Growing Swarm is just fine. I would tend to stick with Fetcher Infection, the Magicka morph, but again, both versions are just fine and are going to do good damage. Now, one of the things about this ability, and the reason that I have it here as a flex spot, if you are the only warden in a group, chances are you at least have a warden healer if you're in a trial, but depending on the content you're in, but if you're the only warden in a particular group and it's not solo content, this ability provides a not quite unique, but a fairly unique buff. It provides Minor Vulnerability, which causes the target to take 5% increased damage. And typically wardens are who are expected to bring this because it's an easy skill to have. It does good damage, and usually you just always have it on your bar. But of course, we only have one bar, so we're a little bit limited on our bar space. So you do a little bit more damage just yourself with Trap Beast. But again, if there's not another warden in the group running Fetcher Infection or Growing Swarm, then I would strongly recommend, it will help your group out if you put it on and just replace it with Barb Trap. The DPS difference isn't that much. This is going to increase your damage by 5%. As we mentioned with a Barb Trap, it's going to increase by about 5 to 7%-ish. And then also it's increasing your weapon and spell damage by a bit. So it does end up being several K when everything is said and done. However, when you consider if you're in a group, the extra increased damage to everybody else, going with Fetcher Infection or Growing Swarm is actually absolutely going to be more beneficial as a whole to the whole party than just running Barb Trap for yourself. And as we said at the beginning, again, this is a unique buff. This is something that you can bring to the group to help everybody else out. And really that's part of the goal of this build. And then last up here, we are going to be using our bear, our Eternal Guardian. Now, the reason we're using Eternal Guardian as opposed to Wild Guardian is because it does a little bit more damage. And really, that's it. If that changes in the future, just remorph it. Nothing wrong with that. It's really fun. Every time you get enough ultimate to be able to use this ability, you do want to go ahead and be using it. Even if your bear is just attacked, it'll cause it to attack again and will just increase your damage done. I will note that there's kind of a built-in execute here. So whenever an opponent is low on health, 25% or lower, or actually below 25% health, what am I saying? When they're below 25% health, it will do extra damage. It'll do 150% more damage. And so you want to make sure, especially when you're in execute, when the opponent is low on health, make sure you're using this ability. It will definitely help you out. If you forget, it's not the end of the world, but it is something. Again, the whole point of the 1-bar build is to kind of practice, get used to, hitting more skills as you go along. And so, it's a great thing to practice, but don't worry, your bear will still attack like normal if you forget to cast this and you don't always cast it right when you get the ultimate for it. All right, now moving on from that, let's go ahead and talk about gear. So I have a couple of different setups here. When you're first starting out for crafted gear, I would just get something like Order's Wrath is a great crafted set. If you needed a second crafted set, I would go with something like Julianos. I would note for the second crafted set, there's a lot of sets that work. If somebody says, oh, no, this is better or this works well, that's fine. Order's Wrath is really good. I would definitely stick with that one. I would go with something like Julianos. If you have a dungeon set or if you want to get one, I'd recommend Pillar of Nirn instead of Julianos. That would work really well, at least until you get the optimal sets. And then for a monster helm, I would recommend Iceheart. The reason I'm recommending Iceheart because it does frost damage, which sticks with our whole theme, and it'll work good with our setup here. And then the other part of that is it's easy to get. So it is something you'd have to run a vet dungeon, but it's an old world one, so it should be a lot easier to get than some of the other ones. And then the head you get from the dungeon, running it on veteran, and then the shoulder you get from Undaunted Keys at the Undaunted Enclave. And I will note that it doesn't matter where you put those things as long as you have 2 5-piece sets, and then once you get it, the monster set. In the meantime, if you don't have a monster set, any 2-piece set, you could use training, you could use any crafted set, whatever you want to use is totally fine. It's not going to be that big a deal, and honestly, you'll grow out of it so quickly, it's not worth optimizing, in my opinion. Just make sure that you have an ice staff so that you can apply the minor brittle. And then, and it also, if you're crafting gear, leave your jewelry white. Golding out or making blue or purple is super expensive and it's really not worth it. So just if you ask somebody to craft it, white jewelry is totally fine. Don't worry too much about it. And the traits are going to be the same as the more advanced gear, and I'll go over those in just a second. So you'll be wearing 2 5-piece sets and then a monster set if you can, or just some other 2-piece set with the crafted or kind of easier to get gear. Now for the more optimal gear here, which is what I parsed in, of course, just because that's what I ultimately recommend you use. You're going to use the Master's Ice Staff. Now this drops from an arena that is in Craglorn. It's the northwest corner of Craglorn, and it's called Dragon Star Arena. Now, this is something that does take a bit of time, but you can run it on normal. You absolutely do not need the perfected version. The perfected version of the staff actually does have a decent bonus, like things like the Maelstrom perfected weapons. Generally, it's like extra penetration, and it's basically wasted, right? It's like pretty much doesn't give you any benefit. The Master's Ice Staff, if you get the perfected version, it gives you like another 100 spell power, and it's not nothing. It's actually pretty decent as far as perfected bonuses go, but don't think it's not going to make or break anything. We're talking like 1,000 damage or something, maybe at the most. It's not going to be that much, so don't worry about it too much. Totally just go grab it on normal. And then the other set that I recommend is Whirl of the Depths, and this drops from Dreadsail Reef, which is a trial. Now, a lot of people get kind of intimidated and they're scared of running trials. Normal trials are actually, all in all, fairly easy. Okay, if you get a couple of people that have good DPS and have some experience, you're going to be able to move through them fairly quickly. If you're on PCNA and you need help or you're trying to get into trials, there is a link to the Discord here. Hopefully you already have a place. There is a guild finder built into the game, and a lot of even casual and social guilds run normal trials, and you can totally World of the Depths is a great set and a lot of people want it, so don't be afraid to just go in and go in and run and get the gear. And honestly, 1 or 2 runs, honestly not too hard to get a full set. A couple of runs of that trial will get you that set. And again, you also do not need the perfected version. The main reason honestly that you want perfected gear from trials is you want it for the jewelry because the jewelry drops in gold and you can recraft it in gold. And that'll save you like millions of gold, like further down the line. But you don't need to gold out all your gear at first. Having it blue or purple is totally fine until you get to the point where you can get that gold jewelry by running vet stuff. Okay. I mean, if you got money, go for it. But I'm just telling you, it's not something you absolutely need for sure. And then the monster set we're going to go with is Zaan. This drops from Veteran Scalecaller Peak, the helm does. And then again, you get the shoulder from the Undaunted Enclave. That's just the monster set that does the most damage right now. If something else in the future does the most damage, just swap out your monster set. It doesn't matter. It's just whatever does the most damage. And then we're going to use 2 pieces of crit. Now, we can use any crafted set that has critical chance. You could use False Gods, which drops from Sunspire, Zogvin, which drops from, one of the dungeons, one of the newer dungeons that's ice-themed. I forget which one. There's a lot of dungeons where the 2-piece chance is critical chance, and any of them works. It doesn't matter. You can use this and put it on any part of your body. Now, ideally, you would have 5 pieces of medium armor on your body. However, you might find that you're running a little bit low on mag and you might need to, in that case, swap it out and run a couple more pieces of light. And that's totally fine. I would at least leave your monster set and your kilt as your 3 pieces of medium. If you can, go up to 5 medium. That will increase your damage a bit more, but it's totally fine, especially if you're running a lot of solo content. In solo content, you're really going to go with more light because you'll need the sustain. So again, in solo content, go with extra light. In group content, I would go with more medium. And you can just kind of decide, well, what do I think I'm going to be running more of? And then, further down the line, when things change, or if you start running more group content, it's totally fine. You'll have enough transmutes to recraft stuff and whatever, and it won't be a big deal, hopefully. And now for a mythic, because we are going to be running a mythic on the optimized version. Here I parse with Harpooner's Wading Kilt. That is a great mythic to use. Very useful in a lot of situations. If you're running solo, you generally don't want to use the kilt because whenever you take damage, it reduces your critical strike chance that the kilt gives you. Dropping stacks is the lingo we usually use. And so something like Sea Serpent's Coil is really good. That'll increase your damage. Sea Serpent's Coil you can also use in trials. So if you only want to go get one mythic, I would probably say go get Sea Serpent's Coil, and it'll help your damage considerably. You can also, and I'll show you a parse here in a second, where I'm using Ring of the Pale Order, and it actually doesn't drop your damage too much, and that heals you. Now, that is only useful. Ring of the Pale Order is really only useful in solo content now, so keep that in mind. You don't want to use that in group content. In solo content, you could also use the Oakensoul ring. That would be totally fine. But don't feel like you need to go out and farm it. But anyways, Kilt or Sea Serpent's Coil for group content. And then when you're going solo, I recommend Ring of the Pale Order or Oakensoul if you want, or you already have it from some other build, it would be totally fine. I would note if you don't have any mythics yet, then you can also just run 3 pieces of whatever your 2-piece crit set is. As long as it's Magicka or spell damage or critical chance, it's going to be just fine. It's still going to help you out a little bit there. Another note too, while you're farming for your master's eye staff, if you happen to get like a lightning or inferno staff, it's going to be just fine to use that while you're trying to get your eye staff. You can go ahead and switch to this more optimized build at that point because, it might take you a bit of time to actually get that staff. All right, now that's it for our sets. Now let's go ahead and talk about traits. So the traits that I'm recommending are the same on both of these setups, whether you're using crafted or gear that drops from a trial. Okay, so on the eye staff, you can either use charged or precise. Charged is a little bit more damage, but precise is also just fine. And then for a weapon enchant, I recommend poison damage. I know that's kind of weird. It just does a little bit more damage, and that's the whole reason. If you're more concerned with AoE damage, having a weapon damage enchant on your eye staff instead would be better for AoE damage. So just keep that in mind. If you're doing a lot of solo content, probably you want more AoE damage, and so doing something like weapon damage might make sense for you. For all of our body pieces, we're going to go with divines on everything. This includes our head, our monster set. Everything is going to be divines, and then we want max magic enchants. So just make sure if anything drops in medium that you're going to need to enchant it because medium armor that drops generally has stamina enchants on it. On our jewelry, we're going to want bloodthirsty on all of our jewelry, and then we want spell damage enchants on it. Now, when it first drops, it might be dropping an arcane, or if you have someone who just crafted you some gear, they might do something that just gives you max Magicka. That's totally fine. You know, you can wait until you get the optimal gear to get it in Bloodthirsty. Don't feel like you need to transmute something that you're going to like then, you know, get rid of in a month or a week or something like that. You know, just use arcane. That's totally fine. But ultimately, in an ideal situation, you would be using Bloodthirsty with max spell power enchants. And I think that's it for gear. I know that was quite a bit. Hopefully that all made sense. If you have questions about anything, of course, feel free to drop them in the comments below or drop by the Discord, and we are more than happy to help you out there. All right, now moving on to race, Mundus, CP, and everything else. So for race, something like High Elf is going to be the best in slot for a Magicka DPS. However, a Dark Elf is a very close second, and Dark Elves also function really well for stamina classes also. If you're running solo content, a Khajiit can be a very good choice. If you're running group content, Khajiit, though, will tend to be kind of lower on the list because their extra critical damage that you get from being a Khajiit just won't provide you any benefit because it caps out at 125. You can go over 125% critical damage, but it doesn't actually, it caps you at 125. So the extra is kind of wasted. Other than that, any other class, if you pick the worst class for a Magicka DPS, you're probably not, you're not really looking at more than like a 5% DPS loss. So in the grand scheme of things, it's not going to matter too much. If you really love playing Wood Elves that are more stamina focused, just by their racial traits, you know, go for it. I don't think it's that big of a deal. Until you're running really hard, really sweaty stuff, it's not going to matter. And then for Mundus, we're going to go with the Thief Mundus, which increases our critical strike chance. We're just choosing that because it does the most damage. I will note when this changes, usually it changes for all specs and all classes. So if it changes in the future and it's something else, just, you know, change with it. It's not a big deal. And then CP. So for CP here, we're going to be running Wrathful Strikes, which just increases our weapon and spell damage, Deadly Aim, Master at Arms, and then Exploiter. I will note about the Exploiter, if you're running solo, you probably want to change that to something else. I think probably Fighting Finesse is a great way to go. That'll increase your critical damage. You could also do something like Biting Aura, but I think Fighting Finesse is probably the way to go. But in group content, if you have someone providing off balance, then Exploiter is the way to go. It'll give you the most damage. For Red CP, this Red CP is generally do whatever you want. The only CP that you really want as a DPS is Rejuvenation because it's going to increase your resources, your sustain. Everything else is really personal preference. I personally like Fortified. It reduces your damage taken by providing you more armor from just everything passively, whether you're blocking or anything else. Expert Evasion gives you a free dodge roll every 30 seconds. And in my experience, you know, running out of stamina and when needing to dodge roll can cost you your life. So it can be a lifesaver in certain situations. And then the last thing I recommend if you're solo is siphoning spells. And that just gives you a little bit of Magicka return so that, you know, whenever you kill mobs. Now, if you're in group content, I think you have to get like the last blow on a mob for that to proc. So I don't recommend it for group content. There you could go with something like Celerity that gives you a 10% extra speed in combat, or really anything else that strikes your fancy or that is useful situationally. For food for this build, I recommend Ghastly Eyeball if you don't need the extra max health. That just gives you max Magicka recovery. If you do feel like you need a little bit extra health, and typically you shouldn't need that in group content because your healer should be taking care of you. But, you know, sometimes you got a fake tank and who knows what's going on. Or if you're running solo, I recommend a Witch Mother's Potent Brew. There are a little bit better versions of this, but they're really expensive, and I don't think it's worth the cost. Like it's very minimal, the benefit you get. But Witch Mother's Potent Brew provides you with max health, max Magicka, and then Magicka recovery. So that's really nice. You're really going to want something with Magicka recovery whenever you're running solo content, especially. All right, now let's go ahead and move on and talk about parsing. So again, we talked about whenever you're parsing, you want to use your Frost Reach every 4 seconds. So every 4 skill casts, you're going to be wanting to use your Frost Reach. And then the next priority is going to be keeping our shocks down. Now, I will note with Magicka shocks, the timing is different than the stamina one. So with the Magicka one, it provides that debuff. And you will see the timer on the debuff. So it'll be 3 seconds, shocks goes off. After 6 seconds, it goes off a second time. And then you'll see a 9-second timer. That's for the major and minor breach. You actually want to go ahead and recast after 9 seconds. So every 9 seconds with the Magicka version, and then I think every 6 with the stamina version, you're going to want to be recasting this. Don't let that timer confuse you and wait the extra 9 seconds. So you're only casting once every 18. This is a big part of our damage. You want to make sure that even if you're doing the Magicka version, you're casting every 9. Stamina, I believe it's every 6. But stamina, straightforward, whatever the timer says. It will go off twice every time you cast it. So don't be confused by that. And then after that, you just keep your dots up. As we mentioned with Barb Trap, you want to recast it 2 seconds before it expires. If you are not doing that at first, it's not the end of the world. You'll get there. You'll get used to it. But really nothing else needs to be said. Use your bear every chance you have the ultimate to do it, and keep all your dots up. And if you need to heal, you've got the Arctic Blast right there, and everything else is good. I do have some useful skills listed on our card there. Some of those are heals. One of them lets you light attack. The Lotus lets you light attack, and it heals you every time you do, or if you heavy attack, it heals you for a bit more. That's something that you can put in your 5 spot. That's kind of your flex spot. But whenever you're actually parsing, you'll just go with your full DPS build, and hopefully Arctic Blast is enough to get you through most content. And before you go to do a pull, you can precast your shocks, and that's a good idea to do. And then, so, when a tank is counting in 3, 2, 1, you'll go ahead and cast your shocks on 3. And then if you can, you run up. And then after that, drop your Barb Trap and just go through your rotation. Just keep all your dots up. That's all you have to do. Nothing really too complicated there. But anyways, guys, I think that's it for this build. Hopefully it was really helpful for you. If you have any questions, feel free to drop in the comments below. If you find this helpful and you found other of my videos helpful, consider becoming a channel member. It starts like $1 a month if you want to become a channel member, and that just helps support me, and I'd really appreciate it. There are some perks. I do release some things, but mostly what you're doing whenever you become a channel member is you're just saying, hey, I like what Night Haro is doing. I want to help support him a little bit. But anyways, thank you very much for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.